The construction site hummed with the rhythm of hammers and diesel engines, dust rising like smoke from the earth. Rebecca wiped her brow and stepped back from the trench she'd been digging for the past 4 hours. 50 yards away, a cluster of men in hard hats and expensive suits stood around blueprints, pointing and nodding. At the center of them was a man whose posture alone commanded the space around him, Mr. Finlay, the billionaire CEO whose name was stamped on half the buildings in the city. Rebecca's breath caught. She squinted through the haze, and there it was again. That mark. The same peculiar birthmark she'd seen on her father's hand every day of her childhood, a crescent moon cradled by 3 dots, like stars falling into an eclipse. It sat on Mr. Finlay's left hand, just above his thumb, vivid even from this distance. Her heart slammed against her ribs. For a moment, she couldn't move. Then her legs carried her forward before her mind could catch up. She weaved through workers and equipment, her boots kicking up clouds of dirt. The suits noticed her first, their conversations faltering. Mr. Finlay turned, his silver-gray eyes narrowing with mild curiosity. "Excuse me, sir," Rebecca said, her voice stronger than she felt. "My father had the same birthmark." The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Mr. Finlay's expression shifted, first confusion, then something harder to read. One of his security guards stepped forward, a wall of muscle in a black jacket. "Ma'am, you need to step back." But Mr. Finlay raised his hand. The same hand. The marked one. "Wait," he said quietly. His eyes locked on Rebecca's, searching her face as if trying to solve a puzzle written in a language he'd forgotten. "What did you say?" Rebecca swallowed. "My father. He had that exact mark. Same hand. Same place. He died when I was 12, but I'd know it anywhere." Her voice cracked. "He used to tell me it meant he was chosen. Marked by something bigger than us." If you're ready to enjoy this story, I humbly request you like and click subscribe. Also let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as amazing and heartwarming as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Mr. Finlay's jaw tightened. He looked down at his own hand, flexing his fingers slowly, as if seeing the birthmark for the first time in years. The air between them thickened with something unspoken, something impossible. Around them, the construction site seemed to hold its breath. "Sir, we really should," the security guard tried again. "I said wait." Mr. Finlay's voice was steel. He took a step closer to Rebecca, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the weight of sleepless nights etched into his face. "What was your father's name?" "Marcus. Marcus Okafor." The name landed like a stone in still water. Mr. Finlay's face went pale. Somewhere in the distance, a crane's warning beep echoed across the site, and Rebecca wondered if she'd just changed everything. The security guard's hand was already on Rebecca's shoulder, firm but not rough, steering her backward. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your station." "Let her go." Mr. Finlay's voice cut through the commotion like a blade. Every head on the site seemed to turn at once. He wasn't shouting, but there was a tremor beneath his words, something raw and unguarded that made even his own people hesitate. The guard released Rebecca immediately, stepping back with his hands raised. "Sir, if this is some kind of scam." "Does she look like a scammer to you, Davis?" Mr. Finlay's eyes never left Rebecca's face. He was studying her now, really looking, and she felt exposed under that gaze, like he could see past her work-worn clothes and calloused hands, past the dust on her cheeks, into the truth she carried in her bones. Rebecca stood her ground, though her legs felt like water. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. I needed you to know. My father," her voice caught. "He told me once that he had a brother. But they were separated when they were babies. A fire," he said. "At a hospital." Mr. Finlay's expression fractured. For a moment, the Titan vanished, and in his place stood a man who looked utterly, devastatingly lost. He brought his marked hand to his chest, pressing it there as if to steady his heartbeat. A fire, he repeated, almost to himself. One of the suits, a sharp-faced man with a Rolex that could buy Rebecca's entire block, stepped forward. "Mr. Finlay, I really think we should continue this conversation in private. There are channels for these kinds of claims." "I don't care about channels." Mr. Finlay's voice was quiet but absolute. He looked at Rebecca again, and this time there was something desperate in his eyes. "Do you have proof? Anything?" Rebecca shook her head slowly. "Just the memory. And that." She pointed at his hand. "My father used to trace that mark when he told me bedtime stories. He said it was the only piece of his brother he had left." The silence that followed was suffocating. Around them, the construction site had gone eerily quiet, workers watching from a distance like spectators at a car crash. Mr. Finlay's jaw worked, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. Finally, he turned to his assistant, a woman with a tablet clutched to her chest. "Clear my schedule," he said. "Sir, you have the Meridian Holdings meeting in an hour." "I said clear it." He looked back at Rebecca, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Real, naked fear. "What's your name?" "Rebecca. Rebecca Okafor." He nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward his car, his entourage scrambling to follow. But he paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. His voice carried across the distance between them, quiet but clear. "I'll find you." And then he was gone, leaving Rebecca standing in the dust, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Rebecca's apartment was a fifth-floor walk-up in a building where the elevator had been broken for 3 years. She climbed the stairs slowly, her limbs heavy with exhaustion and something else, something electric and terrifying that thrummed beneath her skin. The encounter at the site replayed in her mind on an endless loop, the way Mr. Finlay's face had changed, the crack in his voice, the desperate question. "Do you have proof?" She pushed open the door to her studio and dropped her bag by the futon. The space was small but clean, every inch maximized. A kitchenette against one wall, a curtain separating her bed from the rest of the room, a bookshelf crammed with second-hand novels and her father's old Bible. On the top shelf, almost hidden behind a stack of photo albums, was a rusted tin box with faded roses painted on the lid. Rebecca hadn't opened it in years. Her hands trembled as she pulled it down, the metal cold against her palms. Inside were the fragments of her father's life, his dog tags from a war he never talked about, a pressed flower from her mother's funeral, a stack of old letters tied with twine. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, was a Polaroid. She lifted it carefully, her breath catching. The image was faded, the colors bleeding into each other, but she could still make out the details. Her father as a young man, maybe 20, standing in front of a church with his arm around a woman Rebecca didn't recognize. He was smiling, broad and genuine, and his left hand rested on the woman's shoulder. The birthmark was there, clear as day, the crescent moon, the 3 dots, exactly as she remembered. Rebecca's fingers traced the edges of the photo. She'd looked at this picture 100 times, maybe more, but she'd never really seen it. Not the way she saw it now. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and opened the browser, typing Frederick Finlay into the search bar. Images flooded the screen. Mr. Finlay at galas, at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, at press conferences with his hand raised in a wave. She zoomed in on one photo, a close-up from a charity event last year, and her stomach dropped. There it was. The same mark. The same placement. Not similar. Identical. She set the Polaroid and the phone side by side on her coffee table, her heart hammering. The marks matched down to the millimeter, down to the way the crescent curved, the spacing of the dots. It wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. Her phone buzzed, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Rebecca Okafor. The voice was smooth, professional. "Mr. Finlay would like to meet with you tomorrow." 10 a.m. at his office downtown. Can you make it? Rebecca looked down at the photo of her father, at the mark that had haunted her since childhood. Yes, she whispered. I'll be there. The line went dead. Rebecca sat in the gathering darkness of her apartment, the Polaroid clutched in her hand, and wondered if she'd just opened a door that could never be closed again. Frederick Finlay stood in the penthouse of his glass tower, staring out at a city that glittered like a promise he no longer believed in. The light stretched to the horizon, millions of lives pulsing below, and he felt none of them. Behind him, his office was a monument to success. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, walls lined with awards and photos of handshakes with presidents and princes. All of it felt like scenery now, like props in a play he'd forgotten he was performing. He looked down at his hand again. The birthmark seemed to burn under his gaze, a riddle written in skin. My father had the same birthmark. The girl's voice echoed in his skull, relentless. He'd tried to dismiss it, tried to tell himself it was a con, a desperate play for money. But the way she'd looked at him, like she'd seen a ghost, that wasn't acting. That was truth, raw and unfiltered. Frederick walked to his desk and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out a leather-bound folder he hadn't touched in a decade. Inside were documents he'd stopped questioning years ago, his birth certificate, immunization records, a single photo of a woman holding a newborn with two bright eyes. Catherine Finlay. The woman who raised him. The woman he called mother. He studied the birth certificate under the desk lamp. Frederick James Finlay. Born February 14, 1978. County General Hospital. Mother, Catherine Finlay. Father, Robert Finlay. Everything looked official, stamped and signed. But as his eyes traced the words, a memory surfaced, small, jagged, something he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it was a dream. He was 7, maybe 8. He'd scraped his knee badly at school, needed stitches. The doctor had asked for his blood type, and his mother had gone pale, fumbling with her purse. I don't remember, she'd said, and the doctor had looked at her like she'd grown a second head. They'd tested him there. O negative. Universal donor. Rare. Frederick pulled out his phone and opened the family medical history his mother had given him when he turned 30. Catherine, A positive. Robert, B positive. He stared at the screen, the implications crashing over him like a wave. You couldn't get O negative from those combinations. It was genetically impossible. His hands started to shake. He thought of other things then, small fractures in the narrative of his life. The way photos of him as a baby were always blurry, always at a distance. The way his mother flinched whenever he asked about his early years. The complete absence of relatives on either side. No grandparents, no aunts or uncles, just Catherine and Robert, a fortress of two. He stood abruptly, crossing to the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. His reflection stared back at him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't recognize the man looking back. Who was he? Whose son? The questions multiplied, splitting like cells, until his mind felt like it would crack under the weight of them. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. Meeting confirmed with Rebecca Okafor. 10 a.m. tomorrow. Frederick closed his eyes, the city lights bleeding through his eyelids in streaks of red and gold. Tomorrow, he would sit across from a stranger who might hold the key to a past he'd never known existed. And if she was right, if this impossible thing was true, then everything he'd built his life on was a lie. The conference room was designed to intimidate. 20 feet of polished table, chairs that cost more than Rebecca's monthly rent, walls of glass overlooking a city Frederick Finlay owned piece by piece. But when Rebecca walked in, clutching a manila folder to her chest like armor, Frederick saw only the birthmark conversation reflected in her eyes, the same questions that had kept him awake all night. He stood, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Thank you for coming." Rebecca sat stiffly, placing the folder on the table but keeping her hand on it. "I almost didn't." "Why did you?" Frederick asked. His voice was quieter than he'd intended, almost vulnerable. "Because my father spent his whole life looking for his brother," Rebecca said simply. "And I think I just found him." The words hung between them, too enormous to dismiss, too terrifying to fully accept. Frederick pushed a folder across the table, his birth certificate, the medical records, the photo of Catherine. "I've been thinking about what you said. About the fire. I did some digging last night." Rebecca opened her own folder, sliding out the Polaroid and a yellowed newspaper clipping. Frederick leaned forward, his breath catching. The headline read, "County General Nursery Fire. Infants evacuated, records destroyed." The date, February 15th, 1978. One day after his alleged birth. "My father kept this his entire life," Rebecca said, her finger trembling as she pointed at the article. "He told me that during the evacuation, babies were separated. Some were reunited with their families. Others—" She looked up at Frederick, her eyes glistening. "Others were given to families who'd been waiting. Families who couldn't have children." Frederick's throat constricted. "Catherine and Robert Finlay tried for years. I heard that story 1,000 times." He paused. "But they never explained why they suddenly had me after so many failures." "Because they didn't give birth to you," Rebecca whispered. "Someone handed you to them in the chaos. And my father's brother disappeared in the same fire." Frederick stood abruptly, pacing to the window. His mind raced through possibilities, each one more devastating than the last. "We need proof. Real proof." "There was a nurse," Rebecca said, pulling out another piece of paper. "Her name was in my father's notes. Estelle Chambers. She worked the nursery that night. I tracked her down. She's alive, Frederick. She's in a care home about an hour from here." Frederick turned, and for the first time since Rebecca had walked into his life, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of hope. "When can we see her?" "Today," Rebecca said. "If you're ready." Frederick looked at her, this woman who'd been a stranger 48 hours ago, who now might be the only person who could help him find the truth. "I've been ready my whole life. I just didn't know it." The care home smelled of antiseptic and lavender. Estelle Chambers sat by a window in the common room, a shawl draped over her thin shoulders, her eyes sharp despite her 86 years. When Frederick and Rebecca approached, she looked up at them with a knowing expression of someone who'd been expecting this moment for decades. "You have the mark," she said to Frederick before he could even introduce himself. Her gaze dropped to his hand, and something like relief crossed her weathered face. "I wondered if you'd ever come looking." Frederick's heart slammed against his ribs. "You remember me?" "I remember that night," Estelle said quietly. "I remember everything." Estelle's hands shook as she poured herself water from a plastic pitcher, the ice cubes rattling like bones. Rebecca pulled a chair close, while Frederick remained standing, too restless to sit, too afraid to breathe too deeply in case it shattered the fragile truth forming in the air. "There were 17 babies in that nursery," Estelle began, her voice a rasp of memory. "The fire started in the electrical room around 2 a.m. Alarms went off, but the smoke came so fast. We were grabbing infants, wrapping them in whatever we could find, running them outside into the February cold." Her eyes grew distant. In the chaos, the wristbands came off some of them. Tiny plastic things, barely held on anyway. And when the building was cleared, when we were doing head count in the parking lot, we had 2 boys we couldn't identify. Frederick felt his knees go weak. He finally sat, gripping the armrest of the chair. 2 boys. Identical birthmarks, Estelle continued, looking directly at him now. Both on the left hand. Crescent moon, 3 dots. I'd never seen anything like it. The doctor said it was hereditary, that they had to be brothers. But their wristbands were gone, and half the records burned in the fire. She swallowed hard. We did our best. Matched them to families based on weight, features, timing of admission. But it was guesswork. Desperate guesswork. Rebecca's voice cracked when she spoke. You gave one to the Finlays. Estelle nodded slowly. Catherine Finlay had been on the adoption waiting list for 3 years. When she heard about the fire, she came to the hospital. She was insistent. Said it was divine providence. The old woman's face crumpled. I wanted to believe her. So I let her take the larger of the 2 boys. And the other. She turned to Rebecca. The other went home with a young couple named Okafor. They'd brought their son in for a routine checkup that same day and were caught in the evacuation. When things settled, they were so grateful their baby was safe, they didn't question anything. The room spun. Frederick put his head in his hands, trying to process the enormity of it. His entire life, his name, his family, his fortune, built on a mistake. A terrible, irreversible mistake. You could have been raised together, Rebecca whispered, tears streaming down her face. As brothers. My father spent his whole life mourning someone who was alive. I didn't know, Estelle said, her own tears falling now. I swear I didn't know for certain. Not until I saw you walk in here together. The same mark. The same eyes. She looked at Frederick. You have your mother's eyes. Your real mother. I remember her. Frederick's head snapped up. What? She came in during labor. Single mother, terrified. She kept saying she couldn't afford twins, that she could barely feed herself. The nurses tried to help her, but she disappeared after the birth. We assumed she'd abandoned them. Estelle's voice dropped to a whisper. Her name was Grace. Grace Henderson. The name meant nothing to Frederick, but it detonated in his chest like a bomb. He had a mother. A real mother, with a name and a face he'd never seen. And somewhere in the world, she might still be alive, carrying the weight of children she'd been forced to give up. Rebecca reached across the space between their chairs and took Frederick's hand, the marked one. We need to know for sure, she said softly. We need the test. Frederick looked down at their joined hands, at the mark, the crescent moon that had started all of this. Yes, he said. We do. The DNA testing facility was sterile and efficient, the kind of place that dealt in certainties. The technician, a young man with tired eyes, swabbed the inside of Frederick's cheek, then Rebecca's, sealing each sample in a tube with clinical detachment. Results in 72 hours, he said. We'll email them to both addresses you provided. 72 hours. 3 days to wait for an answer that would either confirm Frederick's entire life was a lie or prove that this was all a terrible coincidence. As they walked out into the afternoon sun, Frederick felt unmoored, like he'd been cut loose from gravity itself. What do we do now? Rebecca asked, squinting up at him. Frederick didn't have an answer. For the first time in his career, he couldn't strategize, couldn't plan 10 moves ahead. We wait, he said finally, and hope we're ready for whatever the truth is. But as they stood there on the sidewalk, 2 strangers bound by blood and birthmarks and the wreckage of a fire 48 years old, Frederick realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. And neither was she. The black Mercedes pulled up to Rebecca's building at 7 p.m., sleek and out of place among the rusted sedans and patched-up hatchbacks lining the street. Rebecca watched from her window as a driver stepped out, opened the rear door, and waited. A woman emerged, tall and elegant even in her 70s, wearing a cream coat that probably cost more than Rebecca's yearly salary. Catherine Finlay. Rebecca's stomach twisted. She hadn't told Frederick about the call that had come that morning, the polite, ice-cold voice of his mother's assistant, requesting a private meeting. It would be in everyone's best interest, the woman had said, and the unspoken threat in those words had made Rebecca's skin crawl. Now, watching Catherine approach the building's entrance with the measured steps of someone accustomed to being obeyed, Rebecca wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake agreeing to this. But she'd come too far to back down. She buzzed the woman up. Catherine Finlay didn't belong in Rebecca's apartment. She stood in the center of the cramped space like a diamond in a coal mine, her gaze sweeping over the futon, the kitchenette, the second-hand furniture with barely concealed disdain. When her eyes finally landed on Rebecca, they were cold, appraising, utterly devoid of warmth. "Miss Okafor," Catherine said, her voice smooth as silk over steel. "Thank you for seeing me." Rebecca crossed her arms, refusing to be intimidated. "You didn't give me much choice." Catherine's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it had reached her eyes. Direct. "I appreciate that. It will make this conversation simpler." She reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope, setting it on the coffee table between them. "Inside is a cashier's check for $2 million. All I'm asking in exchange is that you leave the city. Tonight. Disappear, and never contact Frederick again." The words were so absurd, so brazen, that Rebecca almost laughed. Almost. But the check was real. She could see the edge of it peeking from the envelope, the numbers written in confident ink. 2 million. More money than she'd see in 3 lifetimes of construction work. "You're trying to buy me off," Rebecca said slowly. "I'm offering you a future," Catherine corrected. "A comfortable life, free from the struggle you've known. All you have to do is walk away from a fantasy." "A fantasy?" Rebecca's voice rose. "The DNA test will prove." "The DNA test will prove nothing that matters," Catherine interrupted, her composure cracking just slightly. "Even if you share some genetic connection with Frederick, do you truly believe that entitles you to anything? He is my son. I raised him. I built him into the man he is today. You're a stranger with a birthmark and a convenient story." Rebecca stepped forward, anger flooding her veins. "My father died searching for his brother. He carried that grief every single day of his life. And you stole that from him. You stole Frederick from him." Catherine's face hardened into a mask of fury. "I saved Frederick from a life of poverty and obscurity. I gave him everything: education, opportunity, empire. What would your father have given him? A construction job? A life of manual labor?" She gestured at Rebecca's apartment with contempt. Is this what you think he deserved?" The slap of those words stung, but Rebecca forced herself to stay calm. "He deserved the truth. We all did." "The truth is a luxury for people who can afford it," Catherine said coldly. She picked up the envelope and thrust it toward Rebecca. "Take the money. Build a life for yourself. Honor your father's memory by being smarter than he was." Rebecca looked at the envelope, at the promise of escape it represented. She thought about her crumbling apartment, the endless shifts at the site, the weight of unpaid bills crushing her every month. $2 million could change everything. She could disappear, start over, never have to swing a hammer again. But then she thought of her father's face when he told her about his lost brother. The sadness in his eyes, the way his voice broke on the words separated. The Polaroid with the birthmark that matched Frederick's down to the smallest detail. She stepped back. "No." Catherine's expression turned glacial. "You're making a terrible mistake." "Maybe," Rebecca said. "But it's my mistake to make. Now get out of my home." For a long moment, Catherine simply stared at her, and Rebecca saw something flicker in those cold eyes, surprise, maybe, or grudging respect. Then the moment passed, and the matriarch turned toward the door. "When this falls apart," Catherine said without looking back, "and it will, don't come to me for help. You'll have made your choice." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Rebecca sank onto the futon, her whole body trembling. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Frederick. "Your mother just tried to pay me to leave town. I said no. But I think you should know, she's scared. And scared people are dangerous." She hit send and waited, staring at the envelope Catherine had left behind on the table. After a moment, she picked it up, carried it to the trash, and dropped it in. The future she wanted couldn't be bought. It had to be proven. The email arrived at 6:47 a.m. on the third day, while Frederick was sitting in his penthouse with cold coffee and 3 hours of sleep fracturing his thoughts. His phone buzzed, and he grabbed it so fast he nearly dropped it. The subject line was clinical, impersonal, genetic testing results, case number 47829. His hands shook as he opened it. The words blurred together at first, medical jargon and statistical analysis, until his eyes locked on a single line highlighted in the summary. Probability of sibling relationship, full siblings sharing both biological parents 99.97%. The phone slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the marble floor. Frederick stared at nothing, his mind a white noise of shock and vindication and grief all tangled together. 99.97%. Not cousins. Not distant relatives. Siblings. Rebecca Okafor, the woman digging trenches on his construction site, was his niece. His phone buzzed again, Rebecca calling. He picked it up with numb fingers, pressed it to his ear. "Did you see it?" Her voice was wrecked, raw with tears. "I saw it," Frederick whispered. "I have an uncle." Rebecca's words broke on a sob. "My father was right. He was right all along, and he never got to know." Frederick closed his eyes, and suddenly he was seeing it all differently, every memory rewritten with this new truth. The empire he'd built wasn't his birthright. The family name on the buildings wasn't his real name. And somewhere, there had been a man named Marcus Okafor who died searching for him, never knowing how close he'd been. "I'm sorry," Frederick said, and he meant it with every shattered piece of himself. "I'm so sorry he never knew." "Me too." Rebecca's breath hitched. "What do we do now?" Frederick looked around his penthouse, the monuments to success, the evidence of a life built on a foundation that had just crumbled beneath him. What did you do when everything you thought you knew turned out to be a carefully constructed lie? "We tell the truth," he said finally. "All of it." The press conference was scheduled for that afternoon. Frederick's PR team had tried to talk him out of it, arguing for a quiet statement, a controlled narrative. But Frederick was done with control. He stood at the podium in the main conference room of Finlay Tower, cameras flashing like miniature lightning strikes, with Rebecca beside him. She looked terrified, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Frederick reached over and took her hand, the marked one, and held it up for the cameras to see. The birthmarks were side by side now, undeniable, identical. "My name is Frederick Finlay," he began, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "And this is my niece, Rebecca Okafor. We met for the first time 3 days ago on a construction site. We discovered I share a birthmark with her late father, who is my brother. And this morning, we received DNA results confirming that we are full biological siblings, separated as infants during the County General Hospital fire of 1978. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras surged forward, but Frederick held up his free hand. "I know you have questions. So do we. What I can tell you is this. The people who raised me believed I was theirs. They may have been complicit in a system that failed children, or they may have been victims of it themselves. That's something I'm still working to understand. But what I know without doubt is that Rebecca and I share blood, we share history, and we share a father/brother who spent his life searching for the brother stolen from him." Rebecca stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "My father, Marcus Okafor, died 12 years ago. He never stopped looking for his lost sibling. He worked in construction his whole life, built buildings with his hands, and told me every night that one day he'd find his brother." Tears streamed down her face. He did find him. He just didn't know it. The silence that followed was deafening. Frederick squeezed Rebecca's hand, anchoring himself to this one true thing in a world that had turned inside out. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight it had never held before. "This changes everything," he said. "For me. For my family. For the legacy I thought was mine. And I'm ready to face all of it." The construction site felt different now. Rebecca stood at its edge the next morning, watching workers prepare for the day's concrete pour, and all she could see was the irony. Frederick owned this ground, but her father had probably helped build the street it sat on. Legacy was a strange thing, she thought. It could be written in steel or in blood, and sometimes both. Frederick was supposed to arrive at 9 for a final inspection before the project moved to the next phase. Rebecca had wanted to stay away, to give him space after the media firestorm that had erupted since the press conference. But he'd insisted she be there. "It's your site too now," he'd said, and she was still trying to wrap her mind around what that meant. She was checking her phone, messages from reporters she'd been ignoring for days, when the shouting started. "Look out! The crane!" Rebecca's head snapped up. The massive tower crane at the center of the site was tilting, its arm swinging in a slow, terrible arc toward the office trailer where Frederick was scheduled to be reviewing blueprints. Workers scattered like ants, screaming warnings, and Rebecca's heart stopped. The trailer. Frederick was in the trailer. She ran. Her boots pounded across the dirt, her lungs burning as she sprinted toward the flimsy metal structure that was about to be crushed. The crane's shadow swept over her, impossibly huge, and she could hear the groan of metal, the snap of cables giving way. She hit the trailer door at full speed, wrenching it open. Frederick looked up from the plans, his eyes widening in confusion. "Rebecca, what wrong? You need to move." She grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the exit. They stumbled out together just as the crane's arm came down, obliterating the trailer in an explosion of metal and dust. The impact threw them both to the ground, debris raining down around them. For a moment, there was only ringing silence and the taste of concrete dust. Then Frederick was pulling her to her feet, his face white with shock. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." Rebecca's voice was shaking. "Are you?" They stared at each other, and then at the wreckage where Frederick had been standing seconds before. The crane arm had crushed the trailer completely, reducing it to twisted metal. If she hadn't pulled him out. "That wasn't an accident," Frederick said quietly. Rebecca followed his gaze. The crane operator was being pulled from his cab by security, protesting loudly. But something about the scene felt staged, choreographed. The timing had been too perfect, the failure too catastrophic. Within an hour, the police had cordoned off the site. Rebecca sat on the tailgate of an ambulance, a shock blanket around her shoulders, while Frederick gave his statement. She watched him, her uncle, she still couldn't quite believe it, and saw the moment his face changed from shock to fury. He walked over to her, his jaw set. "The operator says someone paid him $50,000 to cut the hydraulic lines. They told him to make it look random, but to make sure I was in the trailer when it fell." "Who?" Rebecca's voice was hoarse. Frederick's eyes went cold. "He won't say. But I can guess." He pulled out his phone and dialed, putting it on speaker. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered. "Frederick, darling, I heard about the incident. Thank God you're safe." "Cut the act, Catherine." Frederick's voice was ice. "I know it was you." Silence on the other end. Then carefully, "I have no idea what you're talking about." "The crane operator is cooperating with police. They'll trace the payment. They'll find you." Frederick's hand was shaking. "You have no proof of anything," Catherine said, and her voice had shed all pretense of warmth. "And even if you did, what would you do? Drag the Finlay name through more scandal? Destroy everything your fath, everything Robert built?" "He wasn't my father," Frederick said quietly. "And you're not my mother. Not anymore." He ended the call and turned to Rebecca. Around them, police officers and investigators swarmed the site, but in that moment it was just the two of them. "I'm sorry," Rebecca whispered. "Don't be." Frederick's voice was raw but steady. She made her choice. She chose her legacy over the truth. Over me. He looked at the ruined trailer, then back at Rebecca. "But I choose differently. I choose you. I choose the truth." Whatever it costs. Rebecca stood, letting the blanket fall. Then we rebuild. Not just this site. Everything. Frederick nodded slowly. And for the first time since this impossible journey began, Rebecca saw something like peace in his eyes. 6 months later, the Marcus Okafor Community Center rose from the ground where the old construction site had been. The building was beautiful, glass and steel and green spaces, designed to serve the neighborhood Rebecca had grown up in. Job training programs, youth centers, health clinics. A foundation built not on wealth inherited, but on legacy reclaimed. Rebecca stood at the podium during the dedication ceremony, wearing a hard hat with site manager stenciled across the front. The crowd that had gathered was a mix: construction workers who become her colleagues, community members whose lives this center would change, and reporters still fascinated by the story of the siblings separated by fire and reunited by a birthmark. "My father used to say that buildings outlive us," Rebecca said, her voice carrying across the open space. "That the things we build with our hands become the world we leave behind." She paused, looking at the center that bore his name. He built this city, piece by piece, with labor and sweat and a heart that never stopped hoping. And today, we honor that. Not with a monument to one man, but with a place that serves the people he loved. She stepped back, and Frederick took her place. He'd changed in the months since the press conference. Still a CEO, still wealthy beyond measure, but carrying himself differently now. Lighter, somehow. Freer. "I've spent my entire adult life building things," Frederick said. "Towers, developments, empires. But I built them on a foundation I didn't choose, with a name that wasn't mine by right." He gestured to the community center. "This is different. This is built on truth. On the memory of a man who deserved better than he got. Marcus Okafor lost his brother to a system that failed them both. But his daughter, my niece, she found me anyway. And together, we're building something that can't be taken away." He looked at Rebecca, and she saw in his eyes the same thing she felt: grief for what was lost, but hope for what they'd found. The crowd applauded, but Rebecca was only aware of Frederick's hand reaching for hers, their matching birthmarks pressed together. After the ceremony, they walked through the center together. Rebecca showed him the workshops where people would learn trades, the classrooms where kids would do homework safely, the clinic where families could get care. "It's perfect," Frederick said quietly. "It's a start," Rebecca corrected. She pulled out a folder from her bag and handed it to him. "I found something else while I was researching. Your real mother, Grace Henderson. She's alive. Living in a care facility upstate under a different name." Frederick's breath caught. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Rebecca's voice was gentle. "I don't know if she'll want to see us. I don't know if she even remembers. But I thought you should know. In case you want to try." Frederick opened the folder, staring at a photocopied driver's license picture. The woman looking back at him had his eyes, his jawline. His mother. His real mother. He closed the folder carefully, his hand trembling. "One truth at a time," he said. "But yes. I want to try." Rebecca nodded. They stood together in the center of the building that bore her father's name and his brother's name, two people who'd been strangers months ago, now bound by blood and choice and the hard work of rebuilding from ruins. Outside, the sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the construction that continued around them. Somewhere in that sprawl was the hospital where they'd been born, the site of the fire that had separated them. But that was history now. This, the center, the truth, the family they were becoming, this was the foundation. And on it, they would build something that could last. Rebecca took off her hard hat and looked at her brother. "Ready to go see if she remembers you?" Frederick smiled, fragile but real. "Together." "Together," Rebecca confirmed. And side by side, marked by the same crescent moon and 3 stars, they walked toward a future they would write themselves. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, do subscribe to our channel because your support keeps the team going, and stick with us because we have many more where this came from. More intriguing and more amazing stories as you can ever imagine. So do check it out and enjoy.